Blacks were set free at that time, naked, penniless, ignorant, defenseless, without clothing, animals, livestock, land, and so they were abandoned. And you gave him civil rights and the 14th Amendment. He couldn't use them. See, first of all, let's take the 14th Amendment, which is now the ones we hear a lot about. Between 1866 and let's say the 1900s, that 14th Amendment was used 319 times. Okay. Out of that, 314 times was by corporations, not blacks. Blacks used it about 4 to 5 times, and guess what happened? They lost every time.
What's up, YouTube family? Welcome back to my space. This is Evans Rayola, and guys, on today's episode, I want us to talk about Claud Anderson, Dr. Claud Anderson, on his book, Black Labor, White World. So, let us do a quick introduction of this episode. Dr. Claud Anderson is a prominent scholar and author who has extensively explored issues of race, economics, history, and particularly focusing on the African American experience in the United States. This book, Black Labor, White World, The Search for Power and Economic Justice, published in 1994, is one of the most well-known works. So this book has key themes in Black Labor and White Wealth. The first one is historical context, where Anderson delves into history of African Americans in the US, detailing how black labor was crucial to building the wealth of the nation. Then the economic disparities, where the book explores the persistent economic inequalities between black and white Americans, arguing that these disparities are a direct result of the exploitation of black labor throughout history. Then there is power and control. Anderson discusses the concept of power in terms of economic control. He posits that true power in America is linked to control over resources and economic capital. Then the last is the strategies and economic empowerment, where Anderson doesn't just diagnose the problem, he also suggests solutions. He advocates for black communities to focus on building their own economic base. So guys, I want you to hear this speech of Dr. Claud Anderson explaining how the white people have been benefiting from the black labor. It is like, just from the words, it's self-explanatory. Black labor, white wealth. We are working and they are getting it. So let us watch this video and then we'll come back, do a critical analysis before we end it. Let us listen in.
Thanks for joining me on this edition of the Journal. With me for this edition is Dr. Claud Anderson, author of Black Labor, White Wealth, and he is also president of the Harvest Institute. Dr. Anderson, thank you for joining us on this edition of the Journal.
Well, Daryl, thank you for having me here.
The Harvest Institute is a black think tank that has as its goal the reforming of American public policy as it relates to blacks.
That's correct. What we want to do is get about the business for the first time in the history of this nation, design a policy that is strictly devoted to the economic and social reform of black America by giving them a national plan that would be proactive in resolving some of the major impediments and conflicts and developing broad racial strategies for dealing with white racism in this country.
A major thrust in that direction is the release of your new text, Black Labor, White Wealth. That book is incredible in the respect that it destroys myths, long-held fallacies, lies, and illuminates history and factuality as it relates to the black condition in America. And by that, more specifically, the institutionalization of racism is exposed for what it really is in American society. You kick over some sacred cows in this book, don't you?
Yes, I do. And that was my primary purpose. What I wanted to do, Daryl, in writing that book was two things. First of all, I wanted to send out a wake-up call to black America. And secondly, I want to prove three things. First of all, is that are blacks in the predicament that we're in, and have we been in this predicament for 400 years because what's been told us, first of all, that it was by divine decree, or that it was genetically inherited, or was it really social engineering? And I went back and found out that it's primarily social engineering. that black folk in the predicament they're in because of social engineering. And what's happened to us all this time, Daryl, is that we've got locked into the lowest status of a no-win monopoly game. That means that we've had wealth in this country redistributed or mal-distributed based on skin color going from the lightest to the darkest, lightest, yellow, brown, black. And the wealth has been skewed. So what happens in this country now is you got the white society controlling almost 100% of all the income, the wealth, the resources, the business, the corporations, the privileges, and all levels of government.
And therein lies the problem.
That's
for
your
blacks.
problem. And the issue is race and resources. And black folk don't have the wherewithal to change their conditions.
And the reason that they have not historically in America had access is because of the way as you point out in the book, the legal system has been stacked against us. The political system has been stacked against us. The access to real property, wealth, money, land has been prohibited by law.
That's
the
right.
Supreme Court has been used as an instrument against us.
And it's still being used as an instrument against you.
Explain that.
Because initially, when the Constitution was written, all the Constitution did was picked up the old public policy that had already begun on black folk. When black folk first arrived in this country in 1619, there was approximately 20 blacks. By 1634, the Maryland colony came into existence. That time you had about 45 blacks in the country. By 1638, something very profound happened, Daryl, that every black person in this country needs to understand. Something very, very profound. What happened in 1638? The Maryland colony put out its first public edict. And what that edict said is that black folks shall never enjoy the fruits of white society. That is very key to what's been happening to you for 400 years.
And that is written and established in American code.
That's right.
Codified as law in
That's
America.
right. And between that point, let's say for about next 20 years, for instance, the European colonies were putting pressure on this country, saying, hey, we didn't send you to America to have a good time, just enjoy yourself and sit back and relax. We sent you to relax. We sent you to America to produce some wealth, some resources for our European continent. And most of the colonies were sending letters back saying, hey, we can't do anything in this country. We don't have the wherewithal. It would take us a lifetime to clear the forest, to move the bricks, to get rid of the snakes and rocks. And we need a labor force to do it. And at that point in time, the white society knew they had a need. So what happened, they brought together a very strong sense of community around that need and said, we got to find a way of resolving that problem. And they looked back at that public edict was put out in Maryland in 1638, which says black folks should never enjoy the fruits of white society, and they expanded it.
Right.
So by 1664, 1665, every colony in the United States enacted a slave law that says black folks shall now constitute a subordinated, excluded, uncompensated, non-competitive, managed workforce for the personal comfort and wealth building of white society. And that became your public policy that remained in existence up until recent times.
Why isn't that taught in public education now? Why don't we know that?
Because what happened immediately after that, all the institutions jumped in and all the nations in this country jumped in to justify slavery, enslaving the black folk. And so the religious institutions said, well, we have to base it on something. So they said, let's base it on biblical principles. Saying the Bible that the blacks were offshoot of Ham, so therefore God had decreed that black folks should be enslaved. And that stayed in effect for about maybe a couple of hundred years, about 100-something years, and all of a sudden they moved over to the biological and said, well, blacks are just basically biologically inferior.
So well, from
and that's what the bell curve is telling you about now.
And the bell curve, of course, is the controversial book assaulting black intelligence as genetically inferior.
That's right.
As the author alleges.
That's right.
Is the case.
That's an extension of the original public policy that was put into place back in the 16th century.
As an extension of that public policy, I think the key here is public policy. What you've talked about and outlined in very brief form is how public policy has been designed in this country around the suppression of a singular racial group.
That's right.
I want to deal with some definitions.
Okay.
Public policy was used to the extent that black people would be suppressed. Coming forward in time, blacks thought that the great salvation of the race could be summed up in one word: integration. Is that true?
Yes, and let me go pick up that public policy and bring you up to that. That public policy stayed in effect until, let's say, 1705, for instance. In 1705, it was codified in what we call the slave codes. And the slave codes said at that time defined how in the future all whites would behave and how blacks would behave. And that's why what they call the Southern ethics, where blacks could not challenge whites or raise his hand to defend himself against a white person.
And in fact, white people were told that it was their duty, in fact, to suppress.
That's right.
And severely handle blacks in order to enforce the status quo, or they themselves would be considered lawbreakers.
Right. In other words, they violated the code, the white code. And see, in that time, what the code said is that every white must enforce this code. Every religious institution must subscribe to it. All levels of government must be responsible to it. Okay, it must be passed on through your social customs, Daryl, and also through your laws. I put a lot of those laws in the back of the book.
Right.
Okay, and once that was codified in 1705, everybody understood the law. Then by 1710, for instance, Virginia then said, now that we have a unified white community, they then broke up the black community by passing what they call meritorious manumission in 1710. And what that says now is to make sure that blacks never have a strong sense of community, a unified self, we will grant meritorious manumission. That's why all these southern states had meritorious manumission laws to any black who goes against his own people.
Which in effect said that blacks could be freed.
That's right.
To enjoy rights and privileges in the society for becoming traitors to their own race.
Right, as a free black, but it would never could be comparable to a white.
Right.
So when that law was passed, then we found that a black could be rewarded for squealing another black, what we call crabbing. And out of a possible 150 so-called insurrections or revolts, slave revolts, a black person squealed in every one of them. Okay, and he was rewarded for squealing on blacks. That's where you get the crabbing in the black society.
Which is why there was virtually never a successful black revolt.
Right. But see, and that kind of a system was never used against any other group in this country. No other group, Chinese, Hispanics, or any other group.
Well, you make a strong case in the text for the singular selection, the purposeful separating out of people of the black race for this kind of treatment on this continent.
To make sure there was never a strong sense of community, because a strong sense of community was a threat to the white society. I remember that public policy said you should be non-competitive. And as a matter of fact, the only monument right now in this country that I'm aware of that even recognized and honored a black for being that kind of a black is still in existence up in Harper's Ferry. You know where John Brown had his raid that night?
Sure.
If you ever go up there right outside the hotel, there's a big brown box there. And there's a big monument carving to the black slave who jumped off the porch the night John Brown's troops entered the town, and John Brown killed him. The town erected a monument to the Sambo, saying this is the kind of black we like.
Going from the historical codifying of suppression of blacks to the point where we had a civil rights movement in this country. The first civil rights movement is not the one that gets talked about very often. In the book, you talk about the first time blacks were freed, and you talk about how that freedom was really an illusion. What do you mean by that? Why weren't blacks free after they were emancipated following the Civil War?
Because first of all, what they gave blacks was three things. First of all, they set him free, and secondly, they gave him supposedly due 14th Amendment due process and a right to vote. And but those things had no power attached to them. Blacks could not protect themselves with that. Because see, everything in the society was based on your ability to be able to take care of yourself. And so blacks were set free at that time, naked, penniless, ignorant, defenseless, without clothing, animals, livestock, land, and so they were abandoned. And you gave him civil rights and the 14th Amendment. He couldn't use them. See, first of all, let's take the 14th Amendment, which is now the ones we hear a lot about. Between 1866 and let's say the 1900s, that 14th Amendment was used 319 times. Okay, out of that, 314 times was by corporations, not blacks. Blacks used it about 4 to 5 times, and guess what happened? They lost every time. Blacks never used the 14th Amendment until 1954. But all major corporations use it. That's when you hear about corporations now being an entity, a person.
Or a person.
They used that 14th Amendment that was given to blacks. They gave it to the corporations. And what they did, and immediately in 1870, they took blacks rights from them, okay? Because they didn't have any power.
So once again, the rights were basically suppressed.
They were just suppressed.
That which had been written into law was now effectively thrown out.
Because blacks couldn't protect themselves. They had no power. And also what had happened at that point in time is that between 1619, when blacks first came in the country, and until the emancipation, all the wealth in this country and all the power was built around the black slave himself. That's where your money and power came from. Contrary to what people keep talking about, well, you know, land is most important. Land was never important. Land, Daryl, was totally useless without blacks. As a matter of fact, President Jackson said that blacks brought 75% of the value to land. You can come in this country, an immigrant, go any place you want to find all the land free. You can just drive a stake in the ground and say, I own from here to that next street. Nobody cared. It had no value. It only had value when you put black slaves on it. And that's why all the wealth was concentrated in the South. As a matter of fact, in 1860, out of 66% of all the persons in this country had over $100,000 worth. We're in the South.
Right.
As a matter of fact, and out of the 5 million blacks who were enslaved, they had a net investment value of over $8 billion. That $8 billion was more wealth than all the other corporations and federal government put together.
Sure.
As a white man in the South who had 2 black slaves was richer than any person in the North. The average person in the North, I threw in his house, his business, his land, his clothes, his net worth, and his bank account.
Family, Dr. Claud Anderson is one scholar because he speaks about issues affecting black people, and he speaks in the best way he can. So on his book, The Black Labor, White Wealth, he says that the main goal was just to wake up, to give black people a wake-up call, to tell them that we have been used all these years. It's time that we wake up, you know. The main aim for this book was just but a wake-up call for black folks to start fighting for what is rightfully theirs. I know I have said this time and again. I know it's not easy, but the unity of black people can easily get rid of the white supremacists who are always on the radar waiting to divide us. You know, they use the divide and conquer strategy. They want us to be divided, and that won't happen with teachings just like these ones right here. So many a times there's been a social engineering where wealth has been distributed based on color, you know, white, yellow, brown, then now black. White society is controlling almost all of income, wealth, and resources, businesses, corporations, privileges, and all levels, even in the government. Look at how the white supremacists have ensured that all the top spots, all the top privileges are in their hands. So over time, you know, the white society has always controlled America. You know, good examples have been given here. It could be the income, wealth, resources, business. They are the ones who are dominating. Then the Constitution of the US has failed black folks severally. For instance, it picked an old public policy already given to blacks, you know, and they put it to the Constitution. During slavery, there are those policies that black people already given. But now during the Constitution, they implemented some of these policies that they had given blacks before, you know. Then black folks should never enjoy the fruits of white society. This is the white code. Imagine the white people have a code, the white supremacists, that is, have a code where they say that black folks should never enjoy the fruits of the white society. For you to know that this is true, just try and look at the history of America. Look at the Europeans who live in America. Do they pass through the same things? Look at the Chinese. Look at Indians. The only people who go through these problems are black people, black Americans. They could be immigrants, you know. Anyone black in the US just must go through the white code, which says that black folks should never enjoy the fruits of the white society. Then there is no any other group that is treated the same way in America than the blacks. I mentioned that the Chinese, Indians are treated better as compared to how we black people are treated. And he proceeds to mention that the only thing in the US that has appreciated black people is a monument a monument that he explained where it is. He said that that's the only thing over the years that has proven that black people can be appreciated in the US of A. Then immediately after blacks were set free from slavery, we were left naked, penniless, ignorant, defenseless, and we were given nothing. The only thing that we got was the civil rights, the 14th Amendment, but now it did not work afterwards. We are still continuing to talk about racial problems, to talk about unfair treatment, discrimination. You know, it is always a cycle, something that is always on repeat, man. It is really, really sad that black people are languishing in the US. Black people are struggling in the US because of the systems created by white supremacists, system modeled by white supremacists. These systems are tailored for us black folks to suffer in the US of A. Then during those days, land was never important without blacks. Do you know why? Because the blacks gave the white supremacists more value than the land, because the black people were the people who were working in those lands. That's why we are saying that black labor, white wealth. So guys, thank you so much for tuning in to watch this video. Kindly do consider subscribing to my channel for amazing black stories in Africa and in the diaspora. Thank you guys, and see you all in my next video. Goodbye for now.